we were not just in this plain old theater. It never felt like it was a plain old play.
We were really introducing a whole new world to these people who had never met a Jew in their lives.
It's an emotional train. You ride that train every night and twice on matinee day.
It kind of changed the way that I thought about history and also the world.
I had sincerity. I wanted to play this girl that I empathized with and had been murdered by the Nazis. I wanted to play her right.
You know, it's just something that I feel like I will probably carry with me for my whole life.
I remember the house where I was born.
This is Adam Langer, the creator and host of Playing Anne Frank, a podcast about the dramatic life of the Diary of Anne Frank. Over the course of this podcast, we've talked about a play you might well have seen on Broadway or at a school in your hometown, and a movie that won Academy Awards and plays regularly on TCM. How that show and that movie changed the lives of the people who made it. But on this episode, we're going to talk about another version of the story, and chances are you haven't heard this one. That song we're playing comes from a musical adaptation of The Diary of Anne Frank, one that had the seal of approval of Otto Frank and Kermit Bloomgarden, who produced the original Broadway show. It's been nearly 50 years in the making, but it still hasn't made it to Broadway. That doesn't mean it hasn't profoundly affected the lives of its creators too, though. This is episode 6. Don't Call It a Musical. The story we're going to tell in this episode starts out in the 1960s, when pretty much everyone involved in the original production of The Diary of Anne Frank was still around, and they were trying to figure out how the play could make an even greater impact than it already had. There'd been the Broadway play, the touring shows, the George Stevens movie. Putting the story to music? That was the one thing that nobody'd tried yet. This was your first experience in musical theater, more or less. Could you have chosen a more difficult project for your first one?
No, I could not have. It didn't occur to me how hard it would be to get past the assumptions of people, of many people about musical theater, which seems to be insane at a time when Sondheim was already writing Sweeney Todd and West Side Story even isn't exactly a musical comedy. I think it's because it's about the Holocaust, and there is a mindset that says you don't touch it, you don't tamper with it.
That's Enid Futterman. In the 1960s, she was a young writer in the advertising business, and she did a lot of work with a composer named Michael Cohen. He was the music director of Grey Advertising. Michael and Enid collaborated on a number of projects, including this one for Canada Dry.
Love is all, and love just one. Don't miss love, you'll miss the fun. Love us all, and love just one. Don't miss love, you'll miss the fun.
I wrote a lot of Canada Dry commercials. That's how we got together. We wrote things, we got awards.
That's Michael Cohen. He and Enid told me about some of the projects they worked on, both in advertising and out. Michael wrote the music for this song for the actress Madeline Kahn. She sang it in the musical review New Faces of '68.
There is a strange foreign city, 6,000 miles from Berlin, near to the mountains where the Mississippi flows.
Another performer that Enid and Michael worked with was the singer Andrea Marcovici. They'd done some PSAs about drunk driving together.
I want to watch the sun come up another 50 years. I want to write a novel that will bring the world to tears. And I want to see Venice.
Enid remembers that Marcovici suggested maybe they all should work on a musical together. Sounded like a good idea. The only question was, what would the story be?
Sunday morning, just before 11 o'clock, April 16th. We had been like that before, but never like...
Oh, I didn't have a theater background except that I love musical theater and grew up with it. And that was that for a while. And then one day we were together, Andrea and I, and she was wearing her hair cut to maybe here with a side part and a barrette. And I looked at her and I thought, wow, she looks just like that photograph of Anne Frank on the cover of the diary. And I went into Michael's office the next day and I said, how about this? And neither one of us realized what an uphill climb that was going to be in terms of everything, but certainly even in terms of getting the rights. We were young and naive, perhaps in maybe a good way in retrospect.
I'm sure that there are some people who are listening to the words Anne Frank and musical and saying, oh my God, what? Enid says she got that reaction a lot when she and Michael were developing the project.
We thought it was a good idea, despite the fact that we knew we would be getting Springtime for Hitler jokes. And we did. And people laugh when they hear it, the idea, until they hear the music, and then they mostly understand.
When you think about it, that mindset, that sort of visceral reaction Enid is talking about to the idea of a musical about the Holocaust, it's really more about the word musical than the idea itself. There are operas about J. Robert Oppenheimer and Leon Klinghoffer. There are song cycles about the Holocaust, but a musical? That word has a different ring to it. Michael told me that he and Enid thought of this more as a play with songs than what we think of when we talk about a traditional Broadway musical. But the thing is, it's a lot easier to get people interested in something called a musical than a play with songs.
I reread the diary, and I thought this would be a great opportunity to write music that would be very emotional and heartfelt. So I started to think of what kind of material I wanted to use. I know I didn't want to do period music. I wanted to do music that was more kind of like universal, that wouldn't have a time stamp on it.
The reason we wanted to do this was because the collective equivalent of reading a diary for an audience is to be able to get inside the diarist's head so that you as a group have the same experience, that you are with her, in her mind, in her heart, and you don't experience anything that she doesn't either feel or tell you about. And it's not naturalistic. Music was the best way to get inside of the writer's head.
Dear Kitty,
Hey, this is actor and Jew Joshua Molina. I want to make sure you've heard about my favorite podcast, Chutzpah, with me and Rabbi Shira Stutman.
We study Torah, talk current events and pop culture, interview some extraordinary mensches, and dig into our own personal experiences.
Episodes drop every Friday morning ahead of Shabbat. You can find all episodes of the podcast at chutzpah.com or wherever fine podcasts are handed out for free. Proudly distributed by PRX.
Hey folks, this is Rachel.
And I'm Hero.
From the Pardon My Mind podcast. We're constantly getting to know our minds. And when we have guests, we get to know them behind their public image so that you get to know them beyond their social media presence.
Mental health awareness and inclusivity across the human spectrum, especially with the LGBTQ+ community, is near and dear to us. We find the beauty in being vulnerable.
You can find us wherever you get your podcasts. And don't forget to check out our YouTube channel.
writing a musical or even a play with songs based on the Diary of Anne Frank, well, easier said than done. Turned out Enid Futterman knew someone who knew someone who knew Francis Goodrich and Albert Hackett, who wrote the play and the movie. They played a demo of a song they'd written. He liked the song, and he said if Enid and Michael wanted to write 75% of the score, he'd play it for the Hacketts. So they said okay, and they started to work on spec.
Totally on spec. Yes, we did. There were no guarantees, and it was scary. It got even scarier eventually.
So they wrote 75% or however much of the score. The Hacketts said they liked it, but that wasn't anywhere near enough because in order to get the go-ahead, they needed the approval of Otto Frank. And Otto Frank, he didn't think this story should be a musical. Maybe an opera, he said. Maybe if Leonard Bernstein wrote it. Eventually, someone convinced Otto Frank to give it a listen, and they all met up in London. Well, all of them except Michael Cohen.
It was too difficult for me to go emotionally. I don't think I could go and sit opposite that man and say, your daughter sings this in the first scene and you sing this and this. I said, I can't do that. But from the very beginning, she really wanted to do this. She said, no, nothing would stop her from doing it. So she did go, and she took our little demo tape and played it for Mr. Frank. And from what I was told, he was very moved by it and said that he would help us go forward.
And we all got together and gathered in the townhouse that they were renting in Chelsea. It was the anniversary of the arrest, which took place on August 4th, 1944, but this was August 4th, 1975. And it was an unusually hot summer week. It was unbearably hot. There was no air conditioning anywhere, and everybody was in shirt sleeves. And Otto and Fritzi Frank, his second wife, and her daughter Ava were all there in shirt sleeves with their numbers, their Holocaust concentration camp numbers clearly on their arms. And my ex-husband and I were there, and Kermit and the Hacketts. And it was terrifying because it felt so presumptuous. I knew that Otto Frank had never seen the play, that he felt he couldn't do that. And I realized that this was probably as close as he had come to hearing other people portray his wife and children. And I was very excited about it to begin with, and I thought it would be, it was a wonderful opportunity, but it was also scary in every way. But he was wonderful. At the end, they both dabbed at their eyes with handkerchiefs and apologized for that. And then he said, well, let's go downstairs and have tea, coffee, or pastries or whatever was planned. And we did. And within 10 minutes, he said yes. He said we could have permission.
In the archives of the producer, Kermit Bloomgarden, you can read letters that were exchanged with Otto Frank. And you can see doubt giving way to enthusiasm. As you know, Otto Frank wrote in August 1975, we were very skeptical about a musical version of the diary, but after we listened to the tapes, we were very much impressed by the music. This new approach, he writes, could be worth producing.
And I forget.
It was late 1975 when news first hit the press about a musical called Dear Kitty. Broadway musicals were tackling serious issues in 1975. That's the year A Chorus Line debuted. So did Pacific Overtures, Stephen Sondheim's critique of American imperialism in Japan. But getting people to entertain the idea of a singing Anne Frank was still a challenge. A columnist in Texas wrote that Kermit Bloomgarden would be producing a musical version of the Diary of Anne Frank. The columnist added a little editorial aside in parentheses. If you say so, Kermit, he wrote, but the subject doesn't seem very musical to me. And aside from those kinds of doubts, there were some other practical challenges that needed to be met. Otto Frank said he wanted a couple more songs. That request seemed easy enough to accommodate. There was still a show to write, though, and the thing was that Enid had never written the book to a musical.
I took a model that was the wrong model. I took Pygmalion and My Fair Lady, and I compared them. And that My Fair Lady may be the only musical book that is so close to its source. And basically what I did with, variations was drop the songs into the script. And when the Hacketts saw it, they freaked out. And Albert looked like he was about to have a heart attack, and Francis just dragged him out. It was at Kermit's apartment. And they said, it doesn't work. Your score is beautiful and our play is very good, but they don't work together. And basically, goodbye. And they left, and Kermit said, we'll figure it out. And he tried for a while, but he eventually got very sick and died. And it all fell apart for quite some time.
By the time the show, now called Yours, Anne, premiered, it was the fall of 1985. Otto Frank was dead. So was Kermit Bloomgarten, and one of the playwrights, Francis Goodrich. It opened off-Broadway, on the Upper East Side of Manhattan at Playhouse 91. The advertisements were careful not to call it a musical. It was The Diary of Anne Frank set to music, with a libretto by Enid Futterman and music by Michael Cohen.
And yet, in spite of everything, I still believe that people are going out.
1985 wasn't a banner year for musicals. The one that came out that year and won the big awards was The Mystery of Edwin Drood. Great reviews might have brought Yours, Anne to Broadway, but that wasn't how it turned out. Audiences didn't seem ready for a Diary of Anne Frank set to music, no matter how powerful that music might have been. A critic for Newsday said it was earnest and well-intentioned, but that it was ultimately a misguided show that diminished a document that needs no musical embellishment. The Daily News said it filled the stage with lugubriousness instead of radiance. Frank Rich reviewed it for the New York Times. He called it tasteful but consistently inert. If the heroism and tragedy of Anne Frank are to speak loudly to new generations as they must, he wrote, her words cannot be muffled and diminished by the arch-poetic conceits and pious generalizations of theater. Michael Cohen, he says the critics just didn't get it.
I think it was a little ahead of its time in its structure. The songs didn't have beginnings, middles, and ends, and the word musical was a little misleading. When I thought of it, I was writing music for a play.
In the night, in the dark, I see innocent people, old people.
Throughout the decades, Enid Futterman and Michael Cohen have continued to work on the project. The musical, Yours, Anne, played in Chicago, in Europe, Brazil, and Japan. Enid and Michael thought the Dutch production was particularly good. In 1996, I Remember, their chamber piece for mezzo-soprano, flute, harp, and cello, premiered at the Holocaust Museum in Washington, D.C. And Enid and Michael have also written a song cycle called I Am Anne Frank. But after all those versions, Michael says he's done with it now. He'd just as soon talk about Rappaccini's Daughter, an opera he composed based on a short story by Nathaniel Hawthorne, or the chamber and piano music he's written. He's happy with how his Diary of Anne Frank music turned out, but it's time to move on.
It is what it is. I'm not ashamed of what happened or how it is. Or maybe, yes, I could write a better piece today, given what I know, and my skills have developed more, but that's what it is.
For Enid Futterman, this is still her life's project. She's written a book called Bittersweet Journey, a modestly erotic novel of love, longing, and chocolate, and a musical adaptation of the novel Portrait of Jenny. But Anne Frank is the story she remains devoted to. Even now, 50 years after she started work on it, the hope remains. Maybe it will get to Broadway.
It's a true labor of love. I've never, earned any real money from it, and it doesn't matter. It's about fulfilling its promise in my mind. And I don't care how long it takes. I mean, I hope it happens before I die.
Working on the same story and living with it in the 70s, the 80s, the 90s, and the 21st century, it may seem a little hard to imagine. But when that story is the diary of Anne Frank, it makes more sense. If there's one thing I've learned over the course of this podcast, it's that this story tends to take over the lives of the people who bring it to life. That's how it was even before the play opened on Broadway in 1955. That's how it is today, too. And that's what we'll talk about on the next episode of Playing Anne Frank. You've been listening to Playing Anne Frank. I'm Adam Langer. I'm the executive editor of The Forward. I wrote and created this podcast. It was produced and engineered by Cole Acasio. Our associate producer is Scylla Shaman. She composed the original score, which features Enid Cohen on clarinet. Playing Anne Frank is a production of The Forward. Our editor-in-chief is Jody Radoran, and our CEO is Rachel Fishman-Feddersen. Playing Anne Frank is made possible in part by funding from Canvas, the Cy Sims Foundation, and Barbara Streisand. Our consulting producers are Julianne Hausler, Doug Matica, and Jerome Kramer. Additional editing and research by Samuel Breslow, Irene Katz-Connolly, Mira Fox, PJ Grissar, Beth Harpaz, and Matt Littman. The Forward's VP of Development is Lisa Lepson. Our grants manager is Jason Mandel. Our digital innovation director is Jacqueline DeBonis. Designed by Anya Ulinich and Angeli Zaslavsky. Special thanks to Stephanie Abu, Marie Kuhlman, Elizabeth Ellis, Jay Ehrlich, Whit Licasio, Daniel Liddell, Charlie Meyerson, Lauren Allerhead, Dahlia Shaman, Solveig Zisinich, and to Lauren Pacell of Tink Media and Talia Zaks. The Forward Association is a 501c3 nonprofit organization founded in 1897.